Somewhere in the freezing waters of the South Atlantic, far from any coastline you have ever heard of, there is an island that used to be silent. For almost 100 years, thousands of sheep grazed it down to bare dirt, chewing through grass that had never evolved to survive being eaten. Erosion tore the soil apart. Wind stripped away what little was left. Whole hillsides that were once thick and green were reduced to cracked clay and bare peat. And for decades, that is all this island was known for, a slow, quiet ruin nobody outside a handful of farmers ever noticed. Then one day, every single sheep was removed from that island for good. No slow reduction, no partial fix, all of them gone at once. And what came back from the ocean to take their place was so massive, so strange, and so overwhelming that scientists are still trying to count it decades later, and they still cannot agree on the final number. This is the true story of Steeple Jason, a remote Falkland island that was stripped bare by livestock, abandoned by farmers, and then reclaimed by nature in a way almost nobody outside the Falklands has ever heard about. Before we go further, if strange true stories about nature reclaiming land fascinate you as much as they fascinate me, hit subscribe right now. This channel is built on stories exactly like this one, and what you're about to hear gets more unbelievable the deeper we go. Let's go back to where this began. The Falkland Islands sit in the South Atlantic, hundreds of miles from South America, battered constantly by wind, cold currents, and some of the roughest seas on the planet. Out of the roughly 700 islands and islets that make up the archipelago, most people have only ever heard of the two big ones, East and West Falkland. But tucked away in the far northwest corner sits a small, dramatic cluster called the Jason Islands. Steeple Jason is one of them, a narrow strip of land about 8 kilometers long, cut nearly in half by a thin neck of rock, rising into steep, jagged peaks that give it its name. Here is the part almost nobody knows. Steeple Jason and its neighbor Grand Jason were never meant to stay wild. From the late 1800s all the way until around 1968, these islands were run as working sheep and cattle farms. At the peak, up to 5,000 sheep grazed across this small stretch of land, along with cattle brought in by settlers chasing the same wool boom that shaped the entire Falklands economy. The problem is that the Falkland Islands have no native land-grazing mammals at all. The only natural grazer that ever lived here was a wild goose. That means the native plant life, especially a towering tough grass called tussock grass, evolved for millions of years with almost nothing eating it. It grew tall, thick, and undisturbed, forming dense green walls along the coastlines that could reach up to 3 meters high. Then, humans arrived with sheep, and that ancient balance collapsed almost overnight. Tussock grass has no defenses against constant grazing. Every bite from a sheep weakens the plant permanently. Multiply that by thousands of sheep, decade after decade, and you get the outcome that played out across Steeple Jason and Grand Jason. The coastline was stripped down to eroded clay and bare peat. Wind ripped away topsoil that had taken centuries to form. Once that thick, peaty soil erodes on these islands, it does not simply grow back. In some cases, it is gone for good. By the late 1960s, farming these two islands was no longer sustainable, and the sheep were taken off entirely. Grand Jason lost its livestock by 1970. Steeple Jason followed shortly after. For a while, that was simply the quiet end of a failed farming venture on a remote island nobody visited. Nobody expected what happened next. In the 1990s, a New York philanthropist bought Steeple Jason and Grand Jason. Here's the detail that barely anyone talks about. He specifically negotiated to buy the islands without the sheep, purchasing the land for roughly 5,500 British pounds, stripped of livestock entirely. He then donated both islands to the Wildlife Conservation Society, along with $425,000 to build a permanent research station on Steeple Jason. From that point forward, these two islands belonged to no one but the wildlife. and the wildlife came back in numbers that are almost impossible to comprehend. Today, Steeple Jason is home to the largest black-browed albatross colony on planet Earth. Scientific surveys over the decades have produced staggering, almost unbelievable numbers. A census in 1987 estimated somewhere between 196,000 and 232,000 nests on the island, with more than 150,000 of those actively occupied by breeding pairs. A later aerial survey in 2010 counted over 183,000 occupied nests. Tour operators and researchers who have flown over the island in more recent years have described colonies stretching for nearly 5 kilometers along the southwestern coastline alone, with some estimates placing the total population at roughly 250,000 breeding pairs, which works out to something close to 500,000 individual birds crowding a single stretch of coastline. Even scientists who study this colony for a living cannot agree on the exact number, because it is simply too enormous, too dense, and too remote to count with total precision. Here's a number that puts this in perspective. Some researchers estimate that Steeple Jason alone holds around 70% of the entire global population of black-browed albatross. 70% of an entire species breeding shoulder to shoulder on one island that 30 years earlier was a stripped, overgrazed sheep paddock. And these are not small, forgettable birds. Black-browed albatross can carry wingspans stretching close to 3.5 meters, gliding for hours across the open ocean without a single wing beat. And some individuals have been tracked living beyond 50, even 70 years. They are also famously monogamous, often returning to the exact same partner and often the exact same nest, year after year, performing elaborate courtship rituals that involve beak touching, mutual preening, and a strange, rapid grunting call unique to each pair. Chicks hatch in the Falklands summer, typically in December, and the adults will stay anchored to the colony for 7 or 8 months straight, raising their young before heading back out to sea to spend the rest of the year alone over open water. Picture that scale for a moment. Up to 250,000 pairs, each one raising a single chick, all packed onto cliffs and slopes that sheep had reduced to dirt only a few decades earlier. But the albatross were only the beginning. Rockhopper penguins with their spiky yellow head feathers now nest in the gaps between albatross burrows. Gentoo penguins waddle along the same beaches. Southern giant petrels, some of the largest seabirds on Earth, breed along the cliffs. Imperial cormorants crowd the rocky ledges. Fur seals haul out on the shoreline rocks nearby. And on neighboring Grand Jason, southern sea lions return every year to give birth, with the wider island group producing roughly 200 pups annually. Southern elephant seals come ashore to breed as well, and on rare occasions, southern right whales have been spotted passing through the surrounding waters during their seasonal migration. Researchers who have visited the island describe rockhopper penguin chicks nesting in the narrow gaps between albatross nests, close enough to touch, with the two species simply ignoring each other and going about their own business. Skuas and the local striated caracaras patrol the edges of the colony constantly, waiting for a moment of weakness, an exposed egg, an unguarded chick, because in this ecosystem, even the predators are native and belong exactly where they are. Offshore, small groups of wandering albatross, one of the largest flying birds on the planet, have been spotted mixed in among the black-browed colony, along with royal albatross occasionally passing through. None of these birds were ever reintroduced by a conservation program. Nobody airlifted a single penguin or seal onto Steeple Jason. Every one of these animals found the island on its own, generation after generation, simply because the space, the food, and the safety were finally there again. None of this happened because someone planted anything or built anything. It happened because the sheep left, and the ocean simply moved back in. If a video like this is making you rethink how much power a single ecosystem has to heal itself, drop a comment below telling me which facts surprised you the most so far, because there is more coming, and I want to know if it still holds up as the craziest part of this story by the end. Now here's the part of this story that most nature documentaries skip entirely, because it is not really about the animals, it is about nutrients. Conservationists working across the Falklands describe what happened on islands like Steeple Jason as a nutrient loop finally getting switched back on. Burrowing seabirds spend most of the year out at sea, hunting fish, squid, and krill in some of the richest waters on the planet. When they come back to land to breed, they bring the ocean with them, quite literally, in the form of guano. That waste fertilizes the surrounding soil. Fertilized soil allows tussock grass to grow back thicker and taller than it had in generations. Thicker tussock grass holds the peat soil in place, stopping the erosion that had been quietly destroying the island for a century. And that peat, once stabilized, locks enormous amounts of carbon into the ground. In other words, removing sheep from Steeple Jason did not just bring albatross back. It restarted an entire self-sustaining cycle, where ocean nutrients feed the land holds itself together, and that stability creates space for even more seabirds to return and repeat the process. Conservationists working in the region put it simply: everything on these islands is connected, from the fish in the ocean to the grass on the cliffs to the carbon buried underground. This single fact reframes everything about the sheep removal. It was never just about giving grass a break from grazing. It was about giving an entire ecosystem the chance to remember how it used to function before farming ever arrived. Think about what that actually means physically. Fish and squid living far out in the South Atlantic get pulled up out of the ocean by hunting albatross and petrels, carried back to land inside their bodies, and then deposited directly onto the soil as waste. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of birds, returning to the same patch of coastline every single breeding season for decade after decade. And you are essentially watching an island get fertilized by the ocean itself for free, with zero human involvement. Sheep never did that. Sheep only ever took from the land. Seabirds give back to it. And Steeple Jason is not even the most extreme example in the Falklands. Scientists estimate that less than 0.15% of the original untouched habitat remains across the entire Falkland Islands archipelago. Centuries of sealing, whaling, overgrazing, and introduced predators like rats, cats, and rabbits have left deep scars almost everywhere else, which is exactly why what happened on Steeple Jason matters so much. It proves that even after a century of damage, recovery is still possible, if the pressure is simply removed. There is a strange, quieter detail hiding in this story too. Nesting densely along the tussock edges of Steeple Jason is a bird called the striated caracara, nicknamed locally the Johnny Rook. It is considered one of the rarest birds of prey on the entire planet, found almost nowhere else on Earth outside this remote cluster of islands. Most people watching this video have probably never even heard its name, yet it thrives here in the same recovered habitat that brought the albatross back. And on a nearby island, researchers once uncovered something even stranger while surveying the wildlife: the 10,000-year-old skeleton of an extinct Falklands wolf known as the wara, the only native land mammal these islands ever had before humans introduced sheep, cattle, cats, and rats. The wara went extinct in the 1870s, hunted into oblivion because early settlers feared it would attack their livestock. So in a strange twist, the very animal that vanished because of farming was found buried on an island that later became famous for farming being removed entirely. Not every story in the Falklands ends as well as Steeple Jason's. On New Island, another site once used for sheep farming until livestock was removed roughly 40 years ago, conservation groups are now fighting a much harder battle. Sheep were never the only threat. Rats, mice, feral cats, and rabbits, introduced accidentally or deliberately over the centuries, are still actively hunting native birds today. One native species, the Cobb's wren, has already been wiped out locally on New Island because of these predators, and tussock-dwelling birds there remain severely reduced in number. Globally, invasive predators like these are linked to the vast majority of all recorded extinctions that have ever happened on islands anywhere on Earth, and the Falklands are no exception. Rats and cats do not just eat adult birds. They raid burrows, crack open eggs, and kill flightless chicks before they ever get a chance to fledge, which means a species can quietly vanish from an island over the course of a single generation, long before anyone notices it is gone. Conservationists are currently attempting a full, coordinated removal of all 4 invasive predator species from New Island at once, an operation that requires tracking and eliminating animals across the entire island simultaneously, because leaving even a handful of breeding rats behind can undo years of work in a single season. If it works, it could become a blueprint for restoring dozens of other damaged islands across the archipelago. If it fails, species that survive nowhere else on Earth could disappear for good. It is worth saying clearly that removing sheep is not automatically the answer everywhere in the Falklands, and conservationists there are not trying to eliminate farming entirely. Sheep farming still exists across the islands today, and it remains central to the local economy. There are roughly 70 working farms scattered across the Falklands, grazing just under 500,000 sheep in total, producing enough wool each year to support an export industry that local farmers have spent decades building a reputation around. In a strange, almost postcard-perfect coexistence, the Falklands are also home to roughly 1 million penguins, meaning sheep and penguins often share the exact same coastal pastures without conflict. On some working farms, sheep quite literally walk straight through active penguin colonies, and the penguins do not even react, completely unbothered by an animal grazing a few feet away from their nest. It turns out, livestock and seabirds can coexist just fine, right up until overgrazing crosses a line that the land cannot recover from on its own. Steeple Jason crossed that line decades before anyone stepped in, which is exactly why full removal, not careful management, was the only path left. So what does all of this actually mean? It means an island that was farmed into near ruin, abandoned as a failed venture, then deliberately purchased and protected specifically to keep livestock off it for good, is now home to roughly a quarter of the entire world's population of one of the largest seabirds on the planet. It means that beneath every one of those hundreds of thousands of nests lies a stabilized layer of ancient peat, locking away carbon that would have simply blown away into the ocean 30 years ago. It means one of the rarest birds of prey on Earth is quietly thriving in the same recovered tussock grass. And it means that somewhere out there on New Island, the exact same transformation may be happening again right now, one invasive predator removal at a time. Nature did not need help rebuilding Steeple Jason. It did not need new species introduced, artificial nesting sites built, or decades of expensive intervention. It just needed the pressure removed and enough time left alone to heal on its own terms, on a timeline measured in decades rather than years, which is a timeline most of us never get to witness firsthand. If this story blew your mind even a little, make sure you are subscribed, because this channel covers real, research-backed stories just like this one every single week. Stories about islands, animals, and ecosystems that most people will never hear about anywhere else. Give this video a like if you made it this far. Drop a comment with your honest reaction, and let me know if you want a full, deep dive into New Island next, because that story is still being written right now out in the freezing waters of the South Atlantic, one removed predator at a time. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.